Hey, welcome to Conversations Over Coffee. In this episode, we're kind of revisiting something we began in a previous episode. So if you haven't caught up on that, the link will be either up here or in our description below for you to be able to do that. But really, we've kind of been asking the question, if God, why suffering? And last week we looked at one answer to that. And today in this episode, we're going to look at the logical problem or the logical response to that question. So let's go. Today I had to bring you over to the whiteboard wall because I wanted to introduce you to someone who, if you've ever questioned if it's possible for God to exist because of the suffering or the evil you see in the world, I want you to know this person has asked the question long before you. And his name is Epicurus. And Epicurus was a Greek philosopher who founded what's now known as the Epicurean school, or more of a way of thinking of philosophy. And Epicurus kind of asked this question. And he said, if God is willing to prevent evil, but he's not able, then he's not all powerful. But if he is able to prevent evil, but not willing, then he is not all loving. And then he went on to say, well, if he is both willing and he is both able, then the question has to come, why does suffering exist? And then he would go a little bit further. He would go a step further and say, well, if he's not willing and not able, then why bother calling him God at all? Which is kind of a fair question. So let's formulate this kind of challenge that Epicurus has for a second. And in terms of logic, it works similarly to a maths problem. Similar. It works similar to a maths problem where you have a number of lines of working and then a conclusion. And the lines of working above have to equal the conclusion. For example, 7 plus 3 equals 10. If 7 plus 3, if someone was to write the answer 15, you could go back and you could figure out where they'd made a mistake. So this is how you would formulate the logical problem or the logical challenge of evil to the existence of God. Premise 1 would be, it is logically impossible that suffering and God both exist. Then premise 2 would be, suffering exists, which leads to the conclusion that God does not exist. Now, let's challenge that for a moment. Because on the surface, there is no logical reason to assume that because suffering exists and God exists, that one or the other can't exist. There's no reason to think that. So there must be some hidden assumptions within this argument. So what I want to do, to be fair, is I want to pull out some of those hidden assumptions to make them crystal clear for you. And there's two hidden assumptions within this. And here are the two hidden assumptions. The first one is this, that if God is all powerful, he can create any world that he wants. And the second is this, if God is all loving, he prefers a world without suffering. So let's look at the first kind of hidden assumption, which is that if God is all powerful, he can create any world that he wants. Does that really make sense? Like, think about it. If God is all powerful, he can create any world that he wants. Could he create a world with free will in which everyone does exactly what he wants? Right? There are some things that are just not logically possible because they make no sense at all. For example, someone can't both be married and be a bachelor. It's not possible for me to be married and also at the same time be a bachelor because those two things are it's just inconsistent for it to logically exist. Much like a square circle. Think about that. If you said, hey, God can't create a square circle, therefore he's not all powerful. Well, there's no such thing as a square circle. It doesn't exist. Just like there's no such world where people freely do exactly what you want them to do. It's not free will. So let's look at the second hidden assumption, which is if God is all loving, he prefers a world where there is no suffering. I just don't see why this is the case. First of all, I don't see how we could know this premise or this assumption. But secondly, I know that in my life, there are times that I will allow suffering to occur to myself for a greater good to come out of it. And you think about this any time you have to go to the dentist, right? If you've had braces, when I was younger, I had braces, right? I had buck teeth from sucking my thumb. And one of the only ways to fix these buck teeth was to put braces on them. I had like a headband. It was just a nightmare when you're going through puberty. But anyway, one of the challenges for me was that you had to allow that little bit of suffering for that period of time in order to now be at a stage where your teeth are straight and you can have straight teeth for life. So we know in our own lives, times that we will allow ourselves to suffer or go through uncomfortable things in order for something of a greater good to come out of it. So it just doesn't make sense to me that God would prefer a world with no suffering at all when we experience suffering for good things in our lives. Now, I know that in a video that's only a few minutes long, you probably have more objections than seconds in this video. So here's two things that I want you to know you have to be able to demonstrate if you still resist or push back against the logical problem of evil challenge. The first thing is this: that it is logically impossible for free will to exist. That's the thing you have to demonstrate. That's one of the things in order for this argument to logically hold. You have to show a logical reason why it's impossible for free will to exist. And then the second thing you have to show is that it's logically impossible that God has good reasons for allowing suffering to exist. And I'll be honest with you, that's a really, really challenging task. And in case you don't believe me about just how daunting and challenging that task is, maybe the words of atheist philosopher William Rowe will help kind of back up my point. See, William Rowe said this: some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is inconsistent with the existence of a theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. Now, just because the logical version of the problem of evil doesn't add up or doesn't hold weight, doesn't mean that there may not be good reasons still for disbelieving in God because of all the suffering in the world. In fact, next week in our conversation over coffee, we're going to look at the evidential problem of evil and suffering. You are not going to want to miss that episode if this is something that's piqued your interest. Hey, thanks so much for sticking around till the end of the video. It would mean the world to us if you like this content, if you gave it a like, if you smash the subscribe button. If someone came to mind that you were thinking of throughout this video that you thought it might be helpful for them, feel free to share it with them, and we'll see you next time on Conversations Over Coffee. Car coming by, car coming by, car coming by, car coming by.